last 3 days to have some really amazing discussions around the role of the diaspora in higher education and innovation in Africa. We've had a chance to talk about strengthening relationships between U.S. historically Black colleges and universities and African universities. And we know that that is going to really be key to addressing issues in the African diaspora. We've also had a chance to talk about women of African descent in higher education. What are the opportunities and the challenges for those of us who want to make our livelihood in higher education? And then the fourth session was higher education, a panacea to racism, equity, and promoting social justice. And we've had some amazing discussions there. Dr. Cornell West joined us yesterday along with Dr. Hilary Beckles, and there was a spirited discussion about what we can all do to end racism around the globe. So we've had a great 3 days, and we so appreciate the time that you have spent with us and the wonderful discussions that we've had over the last few days. For those of you who didn't have a chance, of course, because the sessions were parallel sessions, we know that you didn't have a chance to attend all of the sessions. So today, we're going to have an opportunity to hear what were some of the key points that came out of those sessions, and what are the recommendations for how we move forward. So I am going to introduce to you now the Vice President of AAU, Dr. Nicholas Nuama.
Thank you very much. Yes, you are right. We have had some interesting discussions during these past 3 days. And now we've come to the last session where we need to summarize all what has been discussed, put them in their perspective, and then see the way forward. And so I'm going to invite the rapporteurs to make their presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Anthony Rodriguez of Texas Southern University. I'm in the Mickey Leland Center of the university and the center. I am opportune to have been a rapporteur for the session number 4. And I tell criminal, but you saved the life of the person who's been arrested or who's been accused. You saved their life. Professor Bledsoe brought up that the approach that was given was diametrically opposed to the way it happens in the United States of America. It seems as though it works quite in reverse. There's you shoot to kill. You don't try to save the person who's been accused. That was a very important element, I think. Now, that presenter didn't get the opportunity to come back on because we had that discussion actually before our session started. Then we went into hearing from the NAACP, Mr. Johnson, and one keynote point we can say from that discussion is the NAACP is not the NAACP of our grandparents. It's a very brand new organization, pressing forward to be a globally recognized organization, bringing into its fold not just in the US, but across the globe, and specifically in Africa. That was presented very well by them. I'm just speaking on continuing on day 2, we had a very excellent presentation also by Professor Kwasi, who indicated that the continued racism inequity shall continue, were his words, until we address racism. And now exactly how that will be done, that wasn't said, but I'll bring that up on the second day's items. But some of the key points from him was the knowing and having understanding of history and our knowledge. Now, a very important point I need to bring up that he indicated, the question was, is it a panacea of change through the Hbcus? And I'd like to report the first day, the answer was actually no, but it can be. But the answer was it's not, but it can be. Much of the deliberations seem to center around many of the Hbcus following the format of our counterpart, the historically predominant PWIs. So there seems to be a discussion that there must be some degree of change in how we approach it. Dr. Vern Shepard from UE they pointed out the 3 A's: access, agility, and alignment. That was a significant point in the first day, and it carried over into the second day also. Continuing along that line, then came Professor Osei. Right, Professor Osei discussed the issue of access, class position, and the misinterpretation of access and class, and using the standards of the Europeans. Dr. Bertrude gave an excellent history on her institution and their work in social justice over the many decades. One thing, though, I want to say, I'm going to end on day one, was the key point that came out at the end was the word intentionality. And what seems to be the focus on that point was bringing forward with intention, with specific purpose, where there need to be changes. And that's how our day two concluded now on day one. Now, day two was a very different day than day one. We had the same amount of guests, but we basically had 2 speakers. I'd like to share with you that the way day two began, it was really, it was like a moment of camaraderie and joining together among the presenters. And that was actually led by Dr. Cornel West. He really was an amazing person, the way he connected with everyone and caused us just to be talking with each other and just saying hello. Now, he was our first presenter, and I must admit to you, his presentation was such that it covered a multiplicity of areas, and it's most interesting, some of the things he covered, it was almost as though he connected the dots from the first day, and some of the key points he brought up from it was recognizing that how we got where we got, it's because of many persons behind us. He asked us to remember and be thinking about our ancestral traditions, whatever those might have been. He spoke very eloquently about respect, courageousness, being willing to correct each other. He spoke of equity, diversity, inclusion. He spoke of the importance of not taking our stature in academia too highly, not thinking that we are better, because he seems to brought that point forward where there might be a consideration that we have arrived. And I think he was calling upon us to recognize, no, we have not arrived. We have lots of work to do. And because we have arrived on the backs of many others that came before us. He really pressed in a venue of historical philosophy of the black person to some degree. And after Dr. Cornel West, we had the great opportunity to hear from Dr. Hbcus. And now Dr. Hbcus, he spoke of the philosophy and the cultures brought forward by Cornel West, and he brought forward the history and the importance of knowing who we are, knowing where we came from. But he also brought a second very important point, which was the persons of the continent, of the various countries, even after all these name changes since 1894 and the devastation across the country. It's clear there's a lack of knowledge between the African continent in general and the African diaspora of the cross work that's happened. Now, recognizing that the extraction of people of Africa going back to the 1400s, when that first began with the Portuguese, there's still a history to be told. There's still a message to be told. And interestingly enough, Dr. Hbcus pointed out that there's so much misunderstanding and misinformation, not just misinformation, but false histories and false dialogues. So he pointed out some of the important work that's coming out of the University of the West Indies, some of the important work and the recognition of how some of the academic institutions got started, and specifically 1948, the University of the West Indies, which was considered, as he pointed out, the slum of the UK. He went on to give some examples of change that took place because of understanding and knowing the history. One specifically he gave was of the racist Alfred Milner, was a call at the UE once they came to know the history and the truth of that was changed. Now, after the presentation by Professor Hbcus, we truly didn't have sufficient time to really hear much specifically from others, but what we did hear from those who came back from the previous day, including the speakers, was pointing out their acculturization, how they came to their spaces and realizing the importance and the value of each other and knowing each other. I like to say from the key things that need to change. I'm not sure in the outline if those key things that need to change is in respect to the conference or in respect to global change for the African diaspora. So I didn't speak in that. I'd like to probably write that out and provide that again. Innovation around the topic. Now, there is opportunities for innovation. It was very clear based on the deck, the persons who are all speaking. It's very clear there's an opportunity for a significant collaborative effort between the various works being done by the various institutions and various persons. And it seems as though there's a massive opportunity for the African Association of Universities to be that centerpiece in bringing those connections together. I truly hope that's part of some of the planning for the AAU. Now, as far as the policy implications of outcome of the meeting, well, from policy implications, we are thinking, there could be policy for internal operations for academic institutions, and also there's policy implications for NGOs and for governments. So I think those implications require additional consideration, especially, I'm not sure any of you who took the opportunity to saw the discussion that took place last night at the first presidential debate. I think that debate was telling, and every point I know we discussed in the two-day session, it wasn't informed by the debate, but the discussions we had clearly tells us that we need to step it up, because if you can read the tea leaves from that debate, there is a change in the wind right now that is significant, such that without, as they say, Kuji Chagulia Mogolo, brotherhood and unity amidst us, we may be at this very short end of the stick. And I'd like to conclude the one statement that was made at conclusion, I believe, by Professor Hbcus, or it may have been Professor Osei, whether or not we will again allow businesses, will we let big business again brush aside what's happening, is brushed aside, and we will end up not making any significant or real change. That was the last statement made by Professor Hbcus. And that is my report to those who are hearing, and I hope I have the opportunity to re-listen and put this person's names to some of these points and even reconnect with these persons. I truly believe that we are in a moment in time like none other, and it's by no accident the AAU is having its homecoming celebration on the days before, during, and after the first American debate for this presidential election. That's a subject that is going to impact and influence how we operate and what we do for the health and the welfare of the, not just the general public, but of the African nation and of the African diaspora. Thank you very much. I hope I have done my job half
Absolutely.
of Rapporteurs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. Since I started with session 4, I'm going to work my way backwards and go to the rapporteur from session 3. That is Dr. Josephine Jarpa Duwani, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. Dr. Duwani?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, good. So I will start my video in a bit, and I would also be sharing my screen. So I'm starting my video now. Okay, so I thank you all for giving me this opportunity to be the rapporteur for session 3. I have provided, I'm going to make my presentation off a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully we will have that working without any technical hitches. Bear with me, I opened this earlier. And I'm going to go into presentation, slideshow, play from current. Okay, so do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, does it say women of African descent in higher education?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, good. So that's the right one, just to be sure. Okay, so once again, thank you all. It's been an exciting 3 days of this conference, or 2 days going into the third and final. And so I am a professor, associate professor of political science at Howard University, and I was put in charge of the rapporteuring for the third parallel session, Women of African Descent in Higher Education, Opportunities and Challenges. So what I'm going to do is do a quick presentation, allowing time for questions and comments. And I am just going to give us the brief overview of the critical issues that came up. I'm doing mine differently from Dr. Rodriguez, who kind of followed the prompt that we were given. So I start off with the speakers. The moderators were Dr. Beatrice Kamanga Njenga and Professor Amina Mama. The speakers included Martha Mwezi, Professor Akosi Adomakwa-Mpofu at University of Ghana, Legon, Dr. Kebuma Langmia at Howard University in Washington, D.C., Dr. Nado at Temple University, Dr. Faye Williams, National Congress of Black Women, and Professor Carol Boyce, who also was on the speaker list, but for other issues couldn't show up. But I also want to go on to note that the keynote speaker for the session was Professor Jane Nana Opoku-Agyeman, who is the former Minister of Education in Ghana and currently vice presidential candidate on one of the 2 major political tickets in Ghana. And she spoke on a lot of issues, but one thing I want to start off this presentation with is the point she made, which is a quote I have here, that we need history to inform us of women's roles and show us what is possible and what we can still do. And I think this is important because the panel session was opportunities and challenges. And herself and many of the other speakers went back to history. And Dr. Dove especially went back to history, looking at how the place of women, African women, in pre-colonial Africa, and tracing it to where we are now. And why is history important? Because it shows us that the challenges women are facing now are a combination of factors based on history, based on colonial, colonial experiences, and of course, post-colonial experiences. So if we do not understand our history, to know that women played very important roles in the politics, in leadership, in architecture, in education, in cultural spaces like religion, we will question ourselves as to whether what women are doing now is an imported idea or a Western idea. And so it's important for us to understand our history in order to be able to move forward. So some of the general themes, the challenges, right, looking at it from a historical perspective and understanding that we are not always, or we have not always been a subjugated group, minority group within our societies, is to understand that the challenges women face in higher education now, whether in the across the African continent or in the United States, it's human created. Human beings created it. Now, I'm not going to go into the religious part of it, but we as humans created it in different times in history. And so we have to look at it from the historical context and understand, like I said in the beginning, the roles women played in pre-colonial Africa. And to also remember, very importantly, as Professor Opoku-Agyeman mentioned, that when we're talking about women in history, African women in history, who led armies, who led wars, we often get told, well, stop romanticizing it. It's a thing of the past. And she reminded audience members to remember that it is not a romanticization. just as we talk about men and the conquest they did, women who also played important roles in our communities in the past have to be remembered, because that will inform our current situation. So within the historical context, the challenge is that history of Africa generally and history of women's roles in Africa have been rewritten. So we as Africans, we as African women in higher education have a duty to rewrite that history, to set history right. We also have to look at the fact that these challenges are culture-based. And Professor Opoku-Agyeman once again mentioned that culture is dynamic. Some of it is tangible, some of it is intangible. We have to look at the good parts of it and take those parts and continue, and also challenge the bad parts of it. So that also fed into a question that somebody asked in the audience about whether if we do away with the bad parts of African culture, if we are giving away our culture in favor of Western cultures. And somebody said, no, we are not. Just like every culture, Western culture, Eastern culture, whatever you want to call it, they have their good sides and their bad sides. So culture is dynamic, and we have to constantly keep up with our cultures, take what is good and go and leave what is bad. And that plays into how women's roles are translated within the socio-cultural context into higher education. So I'll tie all of that up. So these challenges beyond history, beyond culture, and the dynamics of culture, it's also that they are based within institutions. They are institutional challenges women face within academia. And once again, Professor Opoku-Agyeman asked a question: if women played very important roles in the past as architects, as leaders, why is it that in academia we're having these challenges? And she said we lost something along the line. So once again, that feeds back into the idea of knowing who we are and coming back to reclaim our place in society. These institutional challenges are a lot. Some of them come from the decisions that are made within institutions that may not necessarily provide opportunities for women to advance, to be promoted, and to have opportunities for leadership. And within the institutional context, we also have to look at the African Union as a larger institution, and maybe the AAU kind of flowing out of that. And Professor Beatrice, I think it was Dr. Beatrice, mentioned the issue of having worked within the AAU system and realizing the difficulty of having a policy or policies that were streamlined, strategically focused on the needs of African peoples. Because within the institutional context, all different actors and partners come in with their own agendas, and we're kind of just hopping around with different agendas and dancing to the circus of these partners who may not always necessarily have our interests at stake. So women often are left out of these institutional decision-making processes, and then even if they do, the extent to which they can participate can be limited for different reasons. And we also look at the fact that these issues that women face within higher education are gender-based discriminatory practices. And I use gender-based as different from women-based because gender-based is some of the cultural, social context, some of which flow out of the historical context we have within the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial states in Africa. But the issues of stereotypes of women, that women may not necessarily be good leaders, the fact that women are expected to do certain duties within academia, like the care work. And so we are supposed to be called mothers, even in academia. And Professor Doma Nkrumah Ampofu mentioned, for example, where professors, women are called mama or mommy by their students, and male colleagues don't necessarily get called that. It's nothing wrong with that leadership role that women can be called mothers, but that it takes away that level of authority that a woman is supposed to exert within leadership. So when she goes out of that leadership role, not being as empathetic as we expect, then she is seen as not being the ideal woman. And therefore challenges come from not just students, but also colleagues. And the issues of salary, are women paid equally? Are women promoted at equal rates as men? And all these other stereotypes that women face within higher education. For example, if you're a leader, the few leadership roles we see women as vice chancellors and deputy or pro-vice chancellors, they face an extra burden of discrimination. And then the women-based challenges are also issues that women have the extra burden of work at home. They're not always able to balance the professional and personal demands. And for example, with most institutions now requiring all lecturers to have a higher degree, like a PhD, often these opportunities are outside of the countries that in Africa. So most women who are in childbearing age at that time may not necessarily be able to take care of, advantage of those opportunities because of their personal obligations. So some of the challenges I've laid out, and there were many more, but I'm just looking at the main issues that were discussed. And so what do we do with these challenges? Women have always been leaders, and they continue to lead. We're not going to sit down and cry foul, but it's important that we mention these issues in order to address them. So the opportunities exist, but then I could also call them the strategies. Some of these have been done. A lot of the speakers talked about what they have done. And I group them in three main categories. The first one is the idea of re-education, that we need to re-educate ourselves. Most of the speakers talked about the fact that you often find that women, of course, are the ones who produce these women courses, and the universities are not always open to having these courses offered. But that we have to involve the men in the process. We have to rewrite and reclaim the role of women in African history, and make it importantly that it is not a romanticization. We also have to play a role, and it shouldn't just be women, in challenging the dehumanization and what I term the defeminization of knowledge systems. And we know that within the African continent and across other parts outside of the diaspora, there's this movement of decolonizing knowledge systems. And we have to also engage that from a feminist or woman-centered perspective. And then we have to prioritize African cultural education, which in the past showed women's leadership roles, acknowledged those roles, and respected those roles. So when we are talking about women's empowerment, we are not coming across as doing something Western. This is very African. Beyond the re-education, which is the personal, the institutional level, we also have to look into building strong networks. Some of these exist already. The speakers mentioned the networks they belong to, how the networks have been important to their professional development, but also come with their challenges. We have to look into building a Pan-African system and alliances that would advance women. So the AAU, for example, having this conference, having this panel is one way in which we can build a strong Pan-African system, alliances, and build on what is already there. I have to emphasize that these systems exist already. Women have to also engage in skill sharing, mentoring, lobbying, power structures, and those are all parts of the network. These have been done, that they can do it amongst women educators and also among civil society organizations. And then institutions have a strong role, better coordination with the AU and the AAU. Once again, one of the speakers talked about how there were so many different things going on, different donors, different partners, and there was no coordination. So hopefully we'll be able to have under the AAU better coordination of these policies so that it can translate across the continent and the diaspora. We should also involve women in decision-making in higher education. One of the speakers mentioned that a small percentage of women are vice chancellors and pro-vice chancellors. Dr. Faye, who talked about the experience of women in the United States especially, gave us a lot of data showing that Black women in America are doing a lot more in terms of educational attainment in most of the fields, but maybe STEM, but they still remain low in leadership positions. So we see what is happening in the United States, maybe somehow mirroring what is happening within the African continent, and that is where this global alliance between women in Africa and the diaspora comes in. And then lastly, we should also strengthen alliances between institutions of higher education across the African continent and of course in the diaspora. And I know we had a panel which looked at the HBC alliances, and that could be one way to manage them. So those were the key issues I raised from my rapporteuring. The rapporteur notes will have more details, but this was just a summary of what I came up with, and I am happy to answer any questions or provide any clarification if needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We have a number of people in the chat who are asking for copies of the presentation. So if you would like to share it, if you would share it with Maxwell, if you would email it to Maxwell Amahoit. And all of the presentations that we have available, all of the reports that have come out of these sessions, we will be posting those at aau.org when the presentations are complete. So these reports that you hear today, we will be providing that information back to you later, because we know that people do want a summary of the entire conference. So thank you again. I am going to continue. Oh, let me slow down because I'm trying to reopen to go back to the next speaker. So thank you again, Dr. Duwani. Our next speaker, as I said, I'm going to continue to go backwards, is from session 2, Tori Saka, Tori, are you available? If my tech people could please help me by unmuting her phone.
Yeah.
Okay, you are unmuted now. Thank you.
Yes,
we can hear you.
I am. Yeah. So my name is Selina Tori-Sonsaka. I work in the University of Ghana Business School in Ghana, and I was responsible for covering session 2, which looked at strengthening relationships between U.S. historical Black colleges and universities and African universities. Now, for our keynote speaker, we have Professor Molefe Keite Asante from Temple University. He delivered the keynote speech, setting the pace for discussions for both the first and the second day. We took quite a different approach. The first day was more of looking at the issues or diagnosing the problems. And then on the second day, we went on to look at what the solutions were. Now, in his keynote address, one of the things that came out so strongly was how the Africans has, as Africans, we don't know ourselves. He talked about Carter Wilson, who observed that as Africans, we teach ourselves more about European history, music, and arts, and to the detriment of our own culture and our own ways. And so, navigating the discussion further, he wondered how we could come together without connecting on the basics. He observed that intellectual leadership, the intellectual leadership he'd been attracted to was pan-European in nature, and it created a system that allows us to attach our works and writing to. But until Africans can create their own intellectual system, it will be challenging to surmount that hurdle. He stressed on the need to decolonize our mindsets and reorient ourselves by resurrecting African heroes and deliberately teaching their philosophies to students on our campuses. He emphasized the need to build relationships between African universities and HBCUs, and to explore indigenous knowledge across all fields and subject areas. Concluding on his presentation, he challenged us to think further about who we are, what have we done, what can we do, and how could we explore what our people have done to build some connections between us. We moved on to the second presenter, who also shared his experiences on his experiences on how he decided to start a university because there were existing gaps in the educational system in his country, Ghana. Now, he also, like the first speaker, talked about how our educational system is Eurocentric, and so his approach sought to identify some of the gaps that existed and then to create an awareness, an African awareness amongst the young ones. He reminded us of how Kwame Nkrumah was very deliberate in this approach and how we need to rechart our path towards that deliberation of reorienting our youth through our history, through teaching our history to students in schools. He lamented that accreditation standards are very rigid, and the systems and structures that govern university operations are usually Eurocentric in nature, and it doesn't allow for flexibility for some of these things to be done. And so he was of the opinion that institutions like AAU would play a very critical role in reorienting universities across the African continent to review their standards and reorient curricula to reflect African content. Professor Exra also was one of our speakers, and he shared on he shared on his experiences in his institution. He talked about how much capital, how much intellectual capital we have in Africa, and noted that the sovereignty of the African begins with the state of the mind. And so, like the two other speakers, he stressed the need to decolonize our mindsets by reviewing our curricula, and also talked about, yes, I mean, and also talked about how we could form collaborations and partnerships to utilize the knowledge we generate. Professor Aurora Vergara also further pushed the theme of decolonizing the curricula, and she shared with us how she done that through art. And she talked about the importance of relationship and partnership building and the need to reflect on our cultural experiences. Professor Kamara concluded on what he does at Howard University. He talked about some partnerships and collaborations with some South African universities to build joint programs that seek to do exactly some of the things we had been discussing, like reorienting our curricula. And so his institute is looking at joint programs in ethical leadership, community leadership, spiritual leadership, collaborating with institutions like the Thabo Mbeki Institution and Barack Obama Leadership Institute. He shared on the need. He also concluded with a strong note that Africa needed to decolonize its education to make progress to where we want to go. Now, on the first day, we had a few discussions on what all of this meant. Discussants noted that we do not know each other well enough, and we have so many stereotypes about each other. And some panelists felt that the African continent needed more political will to push this agenda, and we needed to engage the Ministry of Education in our various countries to push the agenda for reviewing the curricula, for setting new standards of accreditation that are more Afrocentric and not Eurocentric. We concluded the day's discussions on a very positive note. The keynote speaker noted that the European slave ships that scattered people across the European slave ships may have scattered people across, but at the core, we are still one people and one family. He said that at the moment, we are reading the same book, but we are all on different pages of the book. And so, but it offered, he saw in this an opportunity to line up our acts towards connecting with each other. And he shared about how Thomas Sankara so many years ago had initiated some actions to have such a center that would bring people together. And so concluding on this, I think the four key things that ran through were partnerships and collaborations. For the first day, partnership and collaborations, reorientation of our curricula, packaging our stories, and setting a Pan-Africa academy and a Pan-Africa agenda. Now we concluded also noting that the AAU stands as a key influencing force in this march or in this journey. On the second day, we looked more specifically at how we could come together. What were the ways we could weave the webs of coming together to work together. I mean, to advance this agenda. And discussions were centered around identifying people who were like-minded and who would come together to form collaborations to push this agenda. Professor Yanka shared with us how some students from North America visited his school and how through exchange on an exchange program, and how it was very educative for them, and how they felt the experience was enriching. And so the discussion centered at promoting such exchanges, academic exchanges, student exchanges, faculty exchanges across levels. We went on to see what Professor Aurora had also done. She also shared her experiences of student exchanges and how these have been very transforming in the lives of students who have partaken in these exchange programs. She talked about how sometimes they would come to Ghana and then return very different people. And so generally, yes, we thought that partnership building is very key to creating connectedness for advancing this agenda. We also, she also shared on the need for advocacy. She noted that even though these are conversations or people are beginning to buy into this agenda, there's still so much need for advocacy in this area. She shared with us the experiences in Colombia, where most faculty were still not African. Most faculty in the African institutes were not African. I mean, even if Africans applied, they were not likely to be offered the job. And so she concluded, noting that there's still some work to be done advancing and promoting the African. We went on to talk about financing all these exchanges and partnerships and collaborations and all. And from our discussions, what came out was that we haven't really packaged ourselves well enough to explore what we have in our midst. Through our discussions, we agreed that there were many resources on the continent, and we could raise funds in the continent to promote the African agenda. So we concluded on packaging ourselves and having conversations, constant conversations. We felt that there was the need to continue to convene this these meetings to advance the conversations on where we want to go with our partnerships. And we thought that AAU play a critical role in bringing us together, in creating the platform to advance these causes. So I'm concluding, yes, so concluding, we thought that this should be, or these conversations should happen every now and again. The team suggested that we needed probably every 6 months, we needed to have these conversations twice in a year. We need to set an agenda to continue to meet and take concrete steps at advancing connectedness between HBCUs and African universities. And we felt that the AAU can create the space for partnership building. And so in a nutshell, these were the discussions from panel session 2.
Thank you so much, Professor Saka. I appreciate your very thorough summary of session 2. We do not have the session 1 rapporteur with us today. However, Professor Osei Darkwa, who was the moderator in that session, has agreed to share with us some of his notes. Please give him some grace, as we have only just informed him a few minutes ago that we would like him to share his thoughts with us. Thank you. Professor Darkwa.
Okay, thanks a lot. And as you say, I was a moderator, so my notes is not as detailed as earlier presenters. So let me share some few ideas about our session, which was panel session 1. We had a keynote speaker in the person of Dr. David Wilson, president of Morgan State University. And then we have 4 panelists, Professor Oyewale, Professor Kumba, Dr. Norma Fonteberry and Professor Josie Jackson Maleti. The session was started by Dr. David Wilson. He was a keynote speaker. He talked about qualities of leadership, and he related this to his experience in meeting a number of African leaders. He talked about how do we educate the next generation of leaders. And then he also made the fact that President Trump has made a number of very disparaging remarks about people of African descent, and they disassociate themselves from those remarks. He emphasized the unite and the need for us to reclaim our oneness. And then, to quote him, he said, "We hold in our hands the golden key to bring about prosperity for our people, and that education should be the driving force to achieve this." And then he went on to outline a number of achievements of Morgan State University. So in brief, that was what he said. Our first panel member, Professor Oyewale, he talks about the expectation of the African universities. He began by outlining some of the challenges posed by COVID-19, and then what are some of the expectations of African universities. He talked about a number of them: documentation and publications. The fact that these days, because of the impact of COVID, is a period of restricted research visits and fellowships. He also encourages governments to keep supporting education on both sides. And then he said we need each other more than ever before. Even though COVID-19 has brought challenges, it has also created new opportunities for us to move forward. So that's briefly what he said. The next was Professor Kumba. He emphasized the need for collaboration, and then he talked about the structures of the Francophone universities. He said that Africa is a well-resourced continent. So why are we facing all these challenges? He talked about if the leaders, the pioneers have not returned, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Jomo Kenyattas, if they haven't returned to do what they did, to lead the continent of Africa to attain political independence and to deal with all those neo-colonialist issues, Africa would have been a different continent. So he talked about the need for us to build bridges and for need for African universities as well as those in the diaspora to put in place structures to accommodate those in the diaspora. He was making an appeal to African educational leadership to make this possible. He talked about mutuality of funding and the need for constant diaspora engagement. So that's a brief summary. The next was Dr. Norma Fonteberry, who talked about the potential role of professional societies in enhancing higher education in Africa. Most of the discussion was centered around his organization, which is the American Society for Engineering Education. He outlined what they're doing and what they continue to do, and the divisions within ASEE, which is his organization, and the need for us to transform undergraduate engineering education. And he made a number of recommendations as well. And the last speaker for our session was Professor Jackson Maleti, who talked about prioritizing African diaspora research and innovative partnership. He emphasized the need for us to build trust, among people of African descent, the need for us to build collaboration, the need for us to enhance linkages between Africa and the global African diaspora, the need for us to change perceptions and narratives, and he emphasized a number of areas for collaboration. Among the areas, he mentioned agriculture and food security, health and nutrition, science, technology and innovation, youth population, climate change, natural resources, mobility partnerships. And he referred to what Carnegie Mellon Foundation is doing and the programs that they have established to enhance this collaboration. She posed the question, what else is needed? And then you talked about African Diaspora Transnational Research and Mobility Fund. The need for us to use this fund to initiate joint doctoral programs. And then he called for a plan of action. So this is what happened day one. Day two, there was a general presentation by a representative from ADB, which is the African Development Bank. And the focus was on funding opportunities from ADB, and she outlined a number of them. After that, the floor was open for people's questions, comments, and contributions. And we had a general discussion around the themes that were discussed day one. So this is a brief summary of our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dakwar. That was a great summary, especially given the fact that we didn't give you much time to prepare. At this point, a couple of announcements and a couple of questions. So first, there are a number of people in the chat who are asking about whether or not these presentations will be available, whether the recordings will be available. They will be. We need to give our tech team some time to put the recordings together and also give us a chance to get all of the reports and to put those together. But you will be, if you're registered for the conference, you will be getting those. There are some people who have asked if they could actually have the chat saved and sent to them. So here's a little trick that I just learned, right? If you have the chat open, at the bottom right of the chat, there are 3 little dots. If you press those 3 little dots, one of the options is Save Chat. So you can actually save the chat and it will come up as a text file on your computer when you close out from the session. So you should wait until towards the end to save the chat so that you get all of the information. And just to let you know that. The next thing I want to let you know is that we are going to be taking questions this session. We weren't sure if we would have time, but given that we do have some time, we're going to be taking questions. And so please use the question and answer feature, not the chat feature, if you have questions for any of the presenters. And while you start posting your questions, I am actually going to ask if any of the other moderators who are with us, I see we've got Lakeisha Harrison, I see we've got Dr. Gary Bledsoe. If any of you would like to comment while people are starting to post their questions in the chat, please raise your hand or turn your cameras on and just let me know, and we will open up your microphone so that you can make any comments that you would like about your sessions, because I know that you both had some great sessions, or if anyone else would like to make any comments. So, Lakeisha, would you like to make any comments? Yes? Okay, tech team, would you please unmute Ms. Harrison's microphone?
All right, I think I can be heard now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just want to first say thank you so much to the AAU for convening this homecoming. And one of the things I've observed since the pandemic started is that as much as we are all isolated individually in our own homes, it has actually made it more possible for us to connect across the globe, across wider spaces in a virtual setting than we ever have before. And so it really has felt like a homecoming, and being able to connect with people I wouldn't have otherwise been able to connect with because we're so far away. And for our panel, on strengthening relationships between HBCUs and African universities, connection was the key in what we discussed. And the only thing I wanted to follow up on is the fact that we expanded the conversation a little bit beyond just HBCUs because of the fact that Professor Vergara was part of the panel. And with her being in Colombia and there are no HBCUs there, we expanded the conversation to discuss how African scholars, in addition to HBCUs who are in other countries in departments of African studies or scholars on other topics who are of African descent, can also connect so that we can move beyond just the linear idea of the United States to Africa, Africa to the United States, and connect globally. How can we strengthen relationships between African scholars around the world throughout the diaspora? And that was intentional because Professor Vergara was part of the panel. And so that expanded the conversation greatly. And what we realized is that there are different unique challenges depending on whether or not you're an HBCU or whether you're a scholar at a place in a country where there are no HBCUs. What are the differences in what we need? But what we realize we all need is a central location and coordination for all of us across the diaspora, whether it's HBCU or not, and that needs to be centered in Africa, and that we call on the Association of African Universities to be that center point around which we can all rally and gather and be the repository of African intellect, resources, information, and finances. That was one of the things that we discussed also, is that finding other ways for us to connect, because money can be a prohibiting factor in students from HBCUs traveling to the continent, people from the continent traveling to HBCUs or other parts of the diaspora. And how can we begin creating our own financing stream so that we are not dependent necessarily on outside resources outside of the African diaspora to help us finance our connections that will strengthen these relationships.
Tracy, you are muted, so you have
Arthurine, you are muted, please.
Oh, I apologize. I was saying I see Dr. Gary Bledsoe, and I want to provide him with an opportunity if he has any comments before we go to the questions. Dr. Bledsoe? Let me unmute you, okay?
Unmuted, okay. Doctor, thank you so much. I've been really totally mesmerized by the presentations this morning. Dr. Rodriguez did an excellent job of actually summarizing and presenting what occurred during our sessions. The sessions were indeed so lively, with such great information from a wide breadth of individuals. One of the things that we did that I thought was really kind of unique, and that is to bring in individuals who are not necessarily within the academy, but who are without the academy, but who could make the work of the academy more effective. We brought in one of the legendary trial lawyers who has beaten the big guys many times, Willie Gary, who's gotten many multi-billion-dollar verdicts, and the head of the NAACP. And we saw the real potential connectedness there. The presentations that we received were really outstanding, but a couple things that stood out to me were Dr. Beckles talking about the value of the diaspora in freeing South Africa, and the issues that he'd uncovered in reference to the creation of Harvard Law School in the U.S. And that showed me all the great work that's being done that maybe that we're not all familiar with. That maybe for one reason or another, it's part of an educational initiative. And so I thought, well, we really probably need to have some kind of unifying force where the efforts that were identified and the great suggestions from people like Dr. Silver and our group need to be carried forward. And so the AAU obviously would be the vehicle that brought us all together. I don't want to put more work on individuals, but it would seem like we'd want to have some kind of collaboration started, informal as it might be, where we can create the kinds of dialogues and communications, receipt of information, so that we know the different kinds of works that people are doing, because maybe some people can help others to get ideas from others and do the kinds of work in different areas that maybe some are doing in other areas, just the ideas. And, you know, it just seems like in many ways some of the great work that's being done, especially in the community throughout the diaspora, where I think it would really do a lot to empower people as people try to push for change and push for advances. The kind of work and information that people are doing, if people are actually equipped with it, they can actually put more value to the work that's actually being done. So I'm hoping that what we can do is consider trying to have some kind of informal collaborative out of this, where we can continue to have some kind of discussion, dialogue, compendium for the receipt of information and thoughts and ideas, and establishing relationships. I know at Texas Southern University, where Dr. Rodriguez and I are, we have a design in Africa and throughout the diaspora. So I think that I've seen the great work that Morgan State has done with many of the nations or institutions of higher education in Africa, for example, and in the Caribbean. And that's the kind of thing that only so many of us, but establishing relationships will allow that kind of network and strengthening each other. So I would suggest that. But I think our event was great. The presenters could not have been better, could not have been better selected. And I think that the information that was presented there will be extremely helpful to bringing about some real positive changes in the world and the community. And what we thought in our group was that indeed this is a time where the opportunity is here, brought about by the murder of George Floyd, sadly. But there's somewhat of an awakening around much of the world. It's become more of a world movement than a movement within the U.S. And so the idea was that we needed to captivate that now, because we don't know how long that'll be there, and strike while the iron is hot. So we need to do something affirmative and come together and move forward. But I just want to take my hat off, Dr. Walker. I think that the AU did a great job here, and this is a beautiful thing. And finally, one of the individuals made this comment that I thought I really should mention, and that is one of our participants said, you know, our ancestors are happy. We're all coming together. And I thought that was such a profound and wonderful comment. And so I'm just hoping we can keep forward with that and move forward and join together and not lose the energy that was created by this beautiful conference. Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Bledsoe. Now I am going to go to our last moderator, Dr. Beatrice Njenga, and see if she has any comments. I'm sending you an unmute. Thank you.
So would this be my last comment? I'm waiting to give a comment. I don't hear you.
It's not your last comment. I've just been going to all of the moderators to have your general feeling about the session that you attended, and if there's anything you want to share with participants about the session that you moderated.
I'd like to appreciate all the excellent presentations and the clear demonstrated interest of diaspora in engaging with the continent, and also the continent engaging with diaspora. And not to take away from all that, my interest is really in what now? What are we going to do differently? And I'm glad that the AAU has opened an office in the USA, a diaspora office, and therefore can help to coordinate our way forward, bringing to bear all those excellent ideas that were coming up. And perhaps we need other offices on other continents just so that we are inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that I know that Professor Ihili is on and has heard you about other offices on other continents. Right now, as many of you know, we have a North Africa office. Professor Amani El-Sharif is on, and she runs the North Africa office. There is an office in East Africa. There is the main office in Ghana, and there are plans, I understand, for a office in South Africa at some point. So I am going to, at this point, take some questions. We've had some questions submitted, and also we have a few people who've raised their hands. So I'm going to take a few questions. The first question I have is probably for Dr. Dawa. With a lot of demands by family on women, what is your advice for women in education? Would either the moderator from session 2 or the reporter from session 2, Dr. Duwani, like to speak to that question?
Okay, so if I understood it, I'm from session 3, just to correct, not 2. So the one on women, you know, that's quote. But I think the general consensus amongst what I gathered during my reporting and also based on discussions I have had is, what can women do? And I think we always place that burden on women. Women constantly have the care duty. What can you do? What should you do? What didn't you do? We've always been doing. And so like Dr. Beatrice said, what else can you, on the other side, do? And this comes to institutions. How can we change institutional norms and practices which have been structured on male-centeredness to make them woman-sensitive? So these are issues that, instead of us, the women, once again, telling the institutions and the world what should be done for us, it's about time the world and the institutions think about what they can do for our women. And so it's a challenge. I can see I'm kind of not answering the question. This is what I do to my students. I turn it around, set a context, and say, you find the solutions. So whoever asked that question I didn't see, I think it's great for us to have a forum that the women will just sit back and say, tell us what you're going to do this time. And take care of, have mothers who are in other spaces, not in education. And if we can begin to find those solutions, not just within higher education, but in other spaces, it will help to make the working environments, wherever they are, conducive for women. And one of the speakers said on our panel, we need to think about women's contribution. Development will escalate and will accelerate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duwani. I think that your comment about people not just asking the question, what can others do, but really looking at ourselves and looking at what we can do. I was in the session that was about promoting social justice and ending racism. And so the next question, learning crisis is real in Africa and has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the pandemic, millions of kids in Africa are currently at home and some roaming about with nothing to do. Dr. Selena, what strategies are in place by AU, by the African Union and African scholars in the diaspora to help reverse this unfortunate trend? Does anyone want to speak to that? Because I think that that could definitely be about the collaboration across universities. Let me unmute you. There you are, Ms. Harrison.
Hi, thank you. So I can't speak for the AAU, obviously, but one of the things I can speak to that was mentioned by Dr. Nyanka, on our panel yesterday was the need to strengthen our knowledge by starting in primary school and making the study of Africa, our history, our peoples, and our cultures a core part of curriculum across the board. And So though children are not getting education right now formally in schools, I think going forward, increase the reinforcement of education at home and the family as well. So that when children are outside of the classroom, if they're being taught in African cultures and their parents have been taught in African cultures and there are other older children in the community and in the neighborhood have been taught in those kinds of things as well, then they can continue working to say won't be completely dependent on just what is coming from the classroom, because there will have been a core universal education that they all have gotten through the course of their primary education and beyond. I cannot offer immediate solutions right now about what's happening with the pandemic. I will obviously defer to others within the AAU or others in the African who may be in a place to speak for the African Union to talk about how that's being addressed right.
And pass them on to the AAU leadership. There is one sort of very simple technical question, and it is there a list of which HBCUs have formal partnerships with institutions in Africa? Also, does it include the nature of those partnerships? Does anyone from our HBCU partnership session with Africa have a response to that?
I am.
Unmute you, Dr. Okay. Tech team, I'm trying to unmute Lakeisha Harrison. Thank you.
I think that's part of what came out of our session is that we don't know all of the different initiatives that are taking place between HBCUs and the African continent. Professor Kamara mentioned several initiatives that Howard University is working on, including a program that I think is really useful, and that is a program in Africa that provides curriculum on education about African Americans. In addition to that, I know that Professor Walker has established partnerships with several other universities, including Morgan State. And then obviously, Professor Aharon is at Delaware State University, and so he has programs there. So we identified during the panel a number of different initiatives between various HBCUs here in the US and African countries or the AAU on the African continent. But to the point of the question, what became apparent even as we were preparing and working through the discussion itself the last 2 days is that there does not appear to be a centralized list where we actually know who's doing what. And if there is, then we weren't aware of it. And so if there's someone else who's on the line now who is aware of a central repository where someone is keeping track of that, then please do tell us, because I want to know myself.
Well, I will comment that at the North America office, it's something that we have looked into and we have not found one either. So we can both continue to look and see if we can find one that will be helpful to all of us.
If I can.
Yeah, I think that's part of the ongoing dialogue, is that, Professor Walker very much said that we need to do this every 6 months. And I think that's part of the reason is that we need to begin to do that. And that, I think, is a first step. And I think Professor Aharon is on and trying to chime in.
Tech team, would you please unmute Professor Aharon? If I could see him, I would.
Yes, he's a co-host. He can. Thank you.
Yes. Am I on?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. I just wanted to respond to the last inquiry about what HBCU is doing what in Africa. I don't know a complete list, but let me say that I'm here because I was invited by AAU based on the conference at Delaware State University that we hosted last year, because Delaware State has the Center for Global Africa, of which I am the founder and the director. And we have a great partnership, unique partnership with the African Union, with the agency of the African Union called African Peer Review Mechanism. And for many people, African Peer Review Mechanism is unknown, but it is a premier and revolutionary organ of the African Union, which has a mandate to evaluate governance and the socio-economic performance of nations with the view to present recommendations that governments implement. And so the partnership that the Center for Global Africa has is one that is designed to filter the large but relatively untapped intellectual capital, to filter that into APRM processes in this way that supports Agenda 2063, in ways that generate development and in ways that are mutually beneficial. And so I encountered AAU because of that conference, and we began to talk about, well, how can we possibly work together to merge our common interests? And so in November, the 12th through the 14th, we're holding our annual conference, which again will be virtual because of the pandemic. But I'm going to get again back with Maxwell and with Brother Kwesi Sam to organize how we can continue the connecting parts, because Dr. Bledsoe, I believe it was, made a very important point about coming together, working together, and being able to identify who's doing what in Africa. So our partnership is designed to work collectively with HBCUs, because that was a big gap that was not being filled. And so the Center for Global Africa took the initiative to establish that partnership, which is designed to do just that. So we look forward to working with AAU to make those relationships more tangible, functional, and measurable.
Thank you so much. So we are at a point where I am going to just take one more question, and let's see, maybe I will go live to Dr. Chioma Blaze Chikere. Has your hand raised? I'm going to unmute you, and if Dr. Chioma Blaze Chikere, if you have a question, I've just unmuted you. You will have to hit the unmute on your phone as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. We have Lizzie Igvine. I'm sending you a notice to unmute. Do you have a question? I was trying to do live questions, but now I'm going to go back to the questions on the Q&A. So one of the questions, and this can be for anyone, is basically we've had this very spirited discussion, and our rapporteurs are documenting what may be some of the possible policy implications. How do we get these ideas and these discussions to policymakers? Does anyone want to address that question? Dr. Rodriguez.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. If I can also use a few seconds of my time in addressing the question. Policy is driven by facts and information. And in the academia, we should have at least working towards much of that. There was a previous question on the, for instance, if there's a database of all the HBCUs who are connected with Africa. You know, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, we should be able to have that database in place within 7 days, 2 weeks maximum. The technology is out here right now, and we know exactly every single one of the HBCUs. It's approximately 108 or 107 still functioning. We know at least 497 African universities. I mean, we have their contacts. It's just a matter of putting together a digital connection, ask the right questions. We have all the information we need instantaneously. Now, coming back to policymakers, I mean, how do we get facts and information? State Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee, she's always said one statement, she says, with facts and information, with good data, we can make choices and make decisions. We just need to get it. So therefore, every HBCU, every academic space needs to be understanding and collecting and being able to decipher its data. Because we are in a time right now where big data, and I do mean big data, and the ability to analyze it, we're using machine learning, AI, and all these various new technologies. We need to be able to harness this type of information, put it to use, quick use, not taking months to get it to the table. So how do we get this? We just need to set the platform. We just need to decide internally, as an institution, you can make certain these things, these addresses, identifying who are your political persons, who are the movers and shakers in the political realm, in the business realm, in all the different sectors. One thing with the academics is given almost like a buy to enter into certain arenas without the normal hassles of a nonprofit many times. But because we are in the academic space, we really should be taking those opportunities. And if I like to say, as far as getting the policymakers, identifying who are policymakers that left our institutions, who are the presidents, who are the governors, who are the senators, who are the congressmen, who are the judges, the mayors. I mean, here at Texas Southern University, we have a significant footprint across the globe. Just the name of this one institution where both Professor Bless and I share a suite, Barbara Jordan, Mickey Lee, and School of Public Affairs. Even though we are HBC of less than 10,000 students, when the Facebook, Twitter, and all these social medias measure the footprint, our footprint expands out. It's bigger than University of Houston, Rice, St. Thomas, all of these PWIs put together. But now, are we using our footprint to maximize the opportunities for the persons in our institutions and Black people and people of color across Africa? That's the question. So that's the space, I think, where we really have to come together, have to collaborate on to make some of these changes happen. But and in closing, I'd just like to take the opportunity. If you see the back of my screen, we have a 2-day COVID-19 conversation. There's some hashtags out there. I mean, there's some QR codes starting tomorrow. And I hope you can pass it and share with others. But this conversation has to continue, but we need a repository. And let me give you something also. Every institution who's hearing my voice right now, the Environmental Science Research Institute, ESRI, provides you free software. It is considered the most authorized database of software available. And they offer it to academics. You pay nothing for it almost. Or you will pay like $100 for a piece of software. It gives you so much data. You can take the same data and map all the HBCUs, map all of the, just here in America. I'm working a project now with Tanzania, some students. Young men, I just found them from YouTube, and I'm training them how to use their cell phones and be data collectors in their own communities and building a database that is actually a true database. With all of these people in these different meetings, we can do so. So how we get the policymakers? We have to have facts and information. We have to have credibility, and we have to have, our data has to be sound. So, the minds I saw in this space, and in just our group in Team 4, Panel 4 yesterday was just truly phenomenal. So, again, we are at the doorway. We can do these things together, but of course we have to recognize the purposes. It has to be a bigger purpose. It has to be bigger than just TSU or Howard or some of one university. It's a collective push. It would be necessary for us to see the change that we need.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. So that was going to be our last question, because it's time that we sort of turn things over for our official closing. I just want to say again, thank you all for coming. I'm going to be turning it over to Her Excellency, Dr. Chihombori-Quao. But I want to say again, thank you for coming. And I think some really important discussions have been started today, and some really important comments that I'm looking at in the chat and in the Q&A feature about the importance of the diaspora, that we are all one people. And we have to remember that when we are looking at each other sometimes as the other. And we so often look at each other, whether it be Africans, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, as other. And we need to start looking at ourselves as the descendants of the people of Africa, that we are all Africans. And if we see each other that way, it is going to be easier for us to collaborate and work together. There's lots of conversation about collaboration. We're going to have to take the time to get to know each other's history, to try to understand each other in order for us to be able to work this way, in order for us to be able to work together. So with that, I would like to turn the session over to Her Excellency, Dr. Arthurine Chihombori-Quao. She is the founder, president, and chief executive officer of the African Diaspora Development Institute. And she is all about bringing us together. So Her Excellency.
Thank you, Arthurine. Thank you for having me.